It was a bright, sunny day when a group of excited tourists arrived at one of the most famous historical sites in the city. The air was filled with laughter and chatter as they snapped pictures and marveled at the grand architecture around them. Among the tourists, there was one young man, let's call him Mark, who stood out from the rest. He wasn't particularly interested in the beauty of the place. Instead, his eyes were fixed on something else. The group had wandered into an area where royal guards on horseback were stationed, standing tall and proud, watching over the monument. Their uniforms were spotless, their faces stern, and their posture perfect. It was a sight that many visitors found fascinating, and they began to gather around, snapping pictures of the guards and the horses. Mark, however, was in a playful mood. As he looked at the horses, a mischievous thought crossed his mind. He saw the guards as part of the display, almost like props in a photo op. To him, they seemed like they were just standing there, doing their job without any real excitement. But to Mark, this seemed like the perfect opportunity for a prank. As his friends continued taking pictures, Mark quietly walked away from the group, moving toward a small area where loose rocks were scattered across the ground. He picked up a few, thinking they were harmless, and started looking back at the royal guard. The horse in front of him was calm, but Mark noticed that it had its head turned slightly, making it the perfect target. Without giving it much thought, he hurled a rock at the horse's side. At first it was just a small thud, but then the horse let out a startled whinny and reared up. The sudden movement caught the guard off guard, and he quickly grabbed the reins, trying to regain control. People around the area gasped, sensing something wasn't right. The situation was quickly turning tense as the horse, startled and frightened by the unexpected rock, pranced nervously in place. The royal guard, now fully aware of what had just happened, turned sharply toward Mark. His face was filled with disbelief at the sight of the young tourist standing there, looking almost smug, as though he had just pulled off a clever joke. Mark didn't immediately understand the gravity of the situation. He thought it was funny, even though the horse's sudden reaction had clearly made many people uneasy. Others who had been observing the incident began to murmur among themselves. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief, while others just stared at Mark, wondering why he had acted so recklessly. The guard, trying to calm the horse, dismounted and walked over to where Mark was standing. His eyes were intense, no longer filled with the stoic expression he had earlier, but now showing a mix of anger and confusion. "Why would you do that?" the guard asked, his voice calm but firm. Mark, who had expected nothing more than a quick laugh and a few stunned reactions, froze. For the first time, he realized the seriousness of what he had done. He wasn't sure what to say, but he could tell that this was no laughing matter. The tourists who had been around him began to take notice of the situation, some approaching cautiously while others stayed at a distance. As the seconds ticked by, the energy of the crowd shifted. What had started as a moment of excitement for Mark was quickly turning into a situation he hadn't expected. He had never considered the consequences of his actions, and now, with the guard standing in front of him, he was starting to realize that this wasn't just a prank, it was something far more serious. The royal guard stood still for a moment, his gaze never leaving Mark. The crowd had grown quiet, watching the scene unfold. The horse, still startled, began to settle down, its hooves gently tapping the ground as the guard tightened his grip on the reins. But his expression didn't soften. There was no smile, no sign of amusement, just a calm, controlled focus and a sense of authority that Mark had not fully understood until now. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The excitement he had felt moments ago, when he thought the prank would be a harmless joke, suddenly felt distant. The reality of the situation hit him like a wave. He realized that the guard wasn't here to entertain tourists or be part of some cheap joke. He was here to protect and uphold the traditions of his role. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Mark had disrupted something much bigger than he had imagined. The guard took a step closer, his boots making firm, controlled sounds on the cobblestone. Mark instinctively took a step back. The guard's towering presence was intimidating, but there was something more powerful in the way he spoke. The calmness of his voice didn't match the tension in the air, and Mark found himself almost afraid to speak. "Do you think this is funny?" the guard asked, his eyes scanning Mark for a response. His voice was steady, but there was a certain firmness that made it clear this wasn't a conversation Mark could easily dismiss. Mark opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. He had expected some sort of lighthearted exchange, maybe a quick scolding or even a joke in return, but this wasn't what he'd anticipated. The crowd around them began to whisper, some casting disappointed glances in his direction. He could feel their judgment in the air, and it made him uncomfortable. I didn't mean any harm," Mark stammered, his voice sounding weaker than he intended. He wanted to apologize, but the words didn't seem enough. What he had done didn't seem like something that could be solved with a quick excuse. The guard didn't respond right away. He was simply observing Mark, his face unreadable. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. The tourists who had gathered, many of whom had been amused by Mark's initial actions, now seemed more hesitant. Some were even shaking their heads. No one liked to witness someone else making a fool of themselves, especially when it caused harm or confusion. The peaceful scene that had once felt like a holiday outing now felt charged with a sense of tension that no one had expected. The guard, with a small but deliberate motion, turned to look at the horse. He gently patted the animal's neck, as if to reassure it that everything was fine. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The horse, still a little shaken, seemed to calm down with the guard's touch. Mark watched the scene unfold in front of him, his own unease growing. He hadn't just scared a horse. He had scared a symbol of the city's history and the respect it commanded. And for what? A quick laugh that had turned sour. The silence between them stretched on, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional murmur from the onlookers. Mark felt as though he were in a time freeze, every second dragging on. He was waiting for the guard to speak again, to tell him what would happen next. Finally, the guard looked back at Mark, his expression still firm, but no longer harsh. "This is not a joke," he said, his words measured and precise. "You need to understand the gravity of your actions. You've caused a disruption, and you'll need to answer for it." The weight of the guard's words hit Mark like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just being scolded, he was being held accountable. And for the first time that day, Mark felt truly small, like the careless prankster he had become in the eyes of everyone around him. Mark's heart was pounding as the guard's words echoed in his mind. The atmosphere felt heavy, and every pair of eyes in the crowd seemed to be fixed on him. He glanced around nervously, realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond what he had imagined. The tourists who had been laughing and taking pictures earlier were now watching him with an expression of disbelief and disappointment. He could feel the weight of their stares, and it made him uncomfortable. Some people were starting to whisper, exchanging thoughts in hushed tones. Mark caught snippets of their conversations, words like disrespect, reckless, and inappropriate. It was clear that what he had thought would be a harmless prank was now seen as something much more serious by everyone around him. He wasn't just a tourist pulling a quick joke. He was now the center of an uncomfortable situation. The guard, still standing before him, seemed to be waiting for an answer. Mark felt the pressure building in his chest. His mind raced as he tried to come up with something to say, but the words didn't come. The truth was, he didn't know how to explain his actions. How could he defend something so clearly wrong? He had thrown rocks at a horse, and that was no small thing. The image of the startled horse rearing up flashed through his mind, and he felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't meant to hurt the animal, but he had done it anyway. "I'm sorry," Mark finally managed to say, his voice shaky. I didn't mean to. I thought it would be funny." The guard's eyes softened just a little, but he didn't let go of his composure. "It's not about whether you thought it was funny. It's about respect. You don't get to decide what's acceptable for others, especially when it comes to their traditions, their history, or their role. His words weren't harsh, but they carried weight. Mark felt himself shrinking under the intensity of them. At that moment, one of the bystanders, a middle-aged woman, stepped forward. She had been watching from the side, her face a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. She shook her head gently, her voice carrying just enough for Mark to hear. "You've embarrassed yourself, young man. You're lucky the situation wasn't worse. What if the horse had hurt someone or panicked? You have no idea what could have happened." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it was firm, and it made Mark feel even worse. He had been so caught up in the thrill of the moment that he hadn't thought about the potential consequences. The guard nodded slightly in agreement, looking back at the woman with a quiet acknowledgement. Mark felt the weight of both their disapproving gazes. He was acutely aware now that everyone around him was disappointed. No one was laughing anymore. What had started as an innocent act of rebellion had turned into a public lesson in responsibility. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He realized that an apology wasn't enough to fix the situation. He had done something wrong, and no amount of regret would erase the unease that had spread through the crowd. He was facing the consequences of his careless actions, and as the moments passed, he knew that this wasn't just a lesson about respect for the royal guard or the horse. It was about respecting the people around him and the customs of a place he was visiting. The guard's calm but stern voice broke his thoughts. "You'll need to stay here while we sort this out. This isn't something we can just ignore." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of his actions like never before. He had made a mistake, and now he was going to face the consequences. There was no escaping it. The crowd continued to watch as the situation unfolded, and Mark realized that he had learned something very important that he would never forget. The crowd continued to murmur as Mark stood there, his palms starting to sweat. The guard had stepped back slightly, keeping a watchful eye on him, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. Mark's heart was still racing, and he could feel his cheeks burning with embarrassment. He was trying to hold it together, but every glance from the onlookers made him feel smaller. Within moments, a security officer arrived on the scene. He was a tall man, wearing a uniform that clearly marked him as someone in charge. He quickly assessed the situation, looking from Mark to the royal guard, and then to the now calmed horse. The officer didn't waste any time. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of authority. The royal guard, who had been standing silently, explained the situation in brief, outlining how Mark had thrown rocks at the horse, startling it, and causing the momentary chaos. The security officer nodded slowly, then turned to Mark. "Is that what happened?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. Mark, now realizing the seriousness of the situation, nodded sheepishly. There was no point in denying it. Everyone had already seen what had happened, and there was no way to make it disappear. He was caught, and now it was time to face the consequences. I thought it was harmless," Mark stammered, still trying to justify his actions. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone or anything." The officer looked at him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he turned back to the crowd, some of whom were still watching the scene unfold. "This isn't a small matter," the officer said, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You can't just mess with the guards or their horses. These are part of our history and our traditions. What you did could have been much worse." Mark stood there, his stomach sinking with each word. He had known it was wrong, but hearing it laid out so plainly made him realize how serious his actions had been. He glanced at the royal guard, who was still standing nearby, watching him with a steady, almost detached expression. The guard didn't seem angry anymore, but Mark could tell that the guard was disappointed, and that hit harder than anything else. The security officer took a step closer to Mark. "I need to ask you to come with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Mark didn't argue. He simply nodded and followed the officer, his feet feeling heavier with each step. The crowd parted slightly as he walked past them, and he could hear the whispers growing louder behind him. Mark could tell that many people were still shaking their heads in disbelief. It wasn't every day that a tourist caused such a scene, and he knew he would be the subject of their conversation for a while. As they walked toward the nearby security office, Mark felt a growing sense of dread. The officer led him into a small room, where they were joined by another security staff member. Mark was asked to sit down, and he did so without protest, though his hands were shaking. He was no longer thinking about how funny the prank had seemed at first. All he could think about now was how much trouble he was in. The security officer, who had been standing silently, spoke again. "You'll have to wait here while we contact the local authorities," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "They'll need to assess what's happened and determine the next steps." Mark's heart dropped at the mention of the authorities. He had heard stories about people getting in trouble for disrespecting local traditions, but he had never imagined that it would be him facing those consequences. As he sat in the small room, the realization hit him harder than ever. What he had thought was a simple joke had now turned into something much bigger than he could have ever expected. He had no choice but to wait, and with each passing minute, he could only think about the lessons he was learning. Lessons he wished he hadn't had to learn the hard way. Mark sat in the small plain room, his mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The officer had left, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The silence in the room felt suffocating, and every ticking second seemed to stretch on forever. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. The way the horse had reacted to the rocks, the guard's stern expression, and the way the crowd had watched him with growing disappointment. It had all happened so quickly, and now the weight of his actions felt overwhelming. He had no idea what was going to happen next. Would he be arrested, fined, kicked out of the city? The possibilities felt endless, and none of them sounded good. Mark had been careless, and now he was paying the price. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the anxious thoughts that kept coming back. He knew he had messed up, but there was still a small part of him that hoped this would somehow be resolved quickly and without too much trouble. Time seemed to crawl as he sat there, wondering when the authorities would arrive. It felt like hours, though it had only been a short time. Finally, the door opened, and the security officer from earlier stepped inside, followed by 2 police officers. Mark immediately stood up, his heart racing again. The officers didn't look angry, but their expressions were serious. One of them, a man with short-cropped hair, stepped forward. "Mark, is it?" the officer asked. Mark nodded, trying to swallow the lump that had formed in his throat. "We've received the full report on the incident. We need to talk about what happened and what comes next." Mark's stomach dropped as the officer continued. "What you did could have caused real harm, not just to the horse, but to others as well. That's not something we can ignore." Mark nodded again, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. "I never meant to hurt anyone or cause any trouble. I thought it would be funny, but I see now how wrong it was. I'm really sorry." The officer didn't say anything for a moment, just watched him with a calculating expression. Then he spoke, his voice still calm but firm. "I understand you didn't mean any harm, but the consequences of your actions are real. The royal guard, the horse, and the traditions you disrupted, all of that matters. You'll need to take responsibility for what you've done." Mark's mind raced. He didn't know what to expect, but he had a feeling that this wasn't going to be a simple matter. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. The officer paused before answering. "We'll be issuing a fine, but that's not all. You'll also be banned from visiting certain areas of the city for a period of time. And depending on the severity of the situation, there may be further consequences. This is a serious offense, Mark." Mark's heart sank at the officer's words. A fine was bad enough, but the idea of being banned from exploring the city, especially since he had traveled so far, was a bitter pill to swallow. He hadn't expected this at all. He had thought it would just be a quick scolding, and then he'd be on his way. But now, he understood that his actions had disrupted not just the guard's duties, but the harmony of the entire place. The second officer, a woman with a stern but not unkind expression, added, "This isn't about punishment for the sake of punishment. It's about making sure you understand the gravity of what you've done. We want to help you learn from this experience." Mark swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. He could feel the weight of their words pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the respect for traditions and the importance of understanding the roles people played in this society. The royal guards weren't just people in costumes. They were symbols of something much bigger, and his thoughtless action had disrespected that. He could feel the embarrassment creeping up his neck again. But this time, it wasn't just shame over the prank. It was shame over the way he had been blind to the bigger picture. He had let his own sense of fun cloud his judgment, and now he was paying the price for it. The officers didn't seem angry, but their seriousness made it clear that this wasn't something to be taken lightly. Mark knew he had no choice but to face the consequences head-on. As much as he wished he could turn back time and undo what he had done, he knew that wasn't possible. All he could do now was accept responsibility and hope that he could learn from this mistake. As the officers finished their discussion with him, they left the room briefly to finalize the details. Mark was left alone again, but this time, his mind wasn't racing with anxiety. Instead, it was filled with a sobering realization. He had been given a lesson, a hard one, but a necessary one. And now he had to live with the consequences of his actions. As Mark sat alone in the small room, his thoughts were racing. The officers had left to handle the paperwork, and now he had a moment to himself. The weight of the fine, the potential ban, and the embarrassment of the situation started to sink in. He had been so caught up in the idea of pulling off a funny prank, something to make his friends laugh and get a few good pictures, that he never considered the consequences. But now, as the reality of the situation set in, he realized just how serious it had all become. He could hear voices outside the room as the officers spoke to each other. They were probably finalizing the details of the fine and the restrictions they would impose on him. Mark couldn't help but wonder how long he would be stuck here. Would they let him leave soon, or would he have to stay in the city longer to sort everything out? He had come for a vacation, to see the sights and experience something new, but now it felt like he was stuck in a never-ending nightmare. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Mark's mind kept wandering back to the royal guard. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the horse had reacted, how the guard had handled the situation with such calm authority, and how disappointed the people around him had seemed. They hadn't just seen someone making a silly mistake. They had seen someone disrespecting something important to them. And that hurt more than anything else. He started to feel the eyes of the crowd in his mind, their disapproval pressing down on him. He thought about the woman who had spoken up earlier, how she had scolded him in front of everyone. He didn't blame her. In fact, hearing her speak had made him feel even more guilty. She had been right. What if the horse had bolted in a different direction? What if someone had been in the way? It could have turned into something much worse. It wasn't just about the horse either. It was about the guard, the traditions, and the respect that everyone deserved. Mark had been too focused on having a good time and getting attention to realize that there was a deeper meaning behind the guard's presence. He wasn't there to entertain tourists. He was part of something important, something that had been built over years of history, and Mark had taken it for granted. The silence in the room felt oppressive, and Mark felt as though the walls were closing in on him. He had never felt so alone and so foolish. He wanted to leave, to go back to his hotel, and pretend that none of this had ever happened, but he knew that wasn't possible. His actions had consequences, and now he had to face them. The minutes seemed to drag on as he sat there, the anticipation of what would happen next gnawing at him. He was sure that by now, word had spread. People would be talking about the tourist who had thrown rocks at the royal guard's horse. He had become a part of the story, but not in the way he had ever imagined. He hadn't even thought about how this might affect the people around him, his friends, or the others who had witnessed the scene. They would probably be just as disappointed in him as the officer and the guard had been. Finally, the door opened, and the security officer entered the room once again. This time, his expression was less stern, but Mark could still see the seriousness in his eyes. He gestured for Mark to stand up, and Mark did so slowly, not quite sure what to expect. "We've handled the paperwork," the officer said. "The fine is in place, and the ban from certain areas of the city will be enforced. You'll need to leave within the next few hours to comply with the restrictions." Mark nodded silently, his stomach sinking. It wasn't as bad as he had feared, but it still felt like a heavy blow. The officer continued, "We're not here to ruin your trip, but you need to understand that actions like yours can't be brushed aside. You'll have a chance to learn from this and move forward, but for now, this is the decision we've made." The officer paused, then added, "I hope this serves as a lesson. It's easy to act impulsively without thinking about the bigger picture, but sometimes the consequences are bigger than you realize." Mark nodded again, his throat tight. He didn't know what to say, but he understood. This wasn't just about him getting into trouble. It was about respect, responsibility, and the awareness of the impact of his actions. The fine, the ban, and the consequences were all part of the process of him learning a valuable lesson. He had made a mistake, and now he had to face the music. As Mark walked out of the small security office, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in an instant. The weight of the fine, the ban from certain parts of the city, and the fact that he had caused such a scene. It all felt so surreal. The peaceful vacation he had imagined now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of his actions. He could still hear the officer's words echoing in his mind. "Actions like yours can't be brushed aside." He had tried to shrug off the consequences of his behavior earlier, thinking it was just a minor mistake. But now he understood how much deeper the situation ran. It wasn't just about a harmless prank gone wrong. It was about respect for people, traditions, and the roles that everyone played in society. Mark's friends were waiting outside, likely unaware of what had happened. They had been enjoying the trip, exploring the sights, taking pictures, and chatting with the locals. Now, Mark would have to face them with the news of what he had done. He wasn't sure how they would react, but he knew that things wouldn't be the same. He had been reckless, and now he had to take responsibility for it. As he approached them, he could see the looks of curiosity and concern on their faces. They had no idea what had transpired while they were waiting. Mark took a deep breath, ready to explain, though he wasn't sure where to begin. "Hey, Mark, what happened?" one of his friends asked, looking at him with wide eyes. "You've been in there for a while. Everything okay?" Mark looked around at the familiar faces of his friends, but somehow everything felt different. The realization that he had made a huge mistake, something that could affect his trip and reputation, made it hard to speak. His throat felt dry as he tried to gather his thoughts. I made a mistake," he finally said, his voice low. "I threw rocks at the Royal Guard's horse." There was a stunned silence for a moment. His friends exchanged surprised glances before one of them spoke up. "You did what?" she asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and concern. "Why would you do that?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, feeling the full weight of their questioning stares. He could feel the judgment, and he knew he deserved it. "I thought it would be funny," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it would cause any trouble, but I was wrong." The group fell silent again. Mark's friends didn't seem angry, but they were clearly disappointed. They had all come to enjoy their time, not to get caught up in a situation like this. Mark could see that they were processing what he had just said, trying to understand how something so simple could have turned into such a mess. One of his friends, a guy who had always been the more practical one, shook his head. "I mean, it's just a prank, right? But I get it. You never know how things will turn out. You scared the horse, and the guard had to deal with it. That could have been a lot worse, man." Mark nodded, feeling his stomach twist. He had been so focused on his own amusement that he hadn't considered how his actions could affect others. He hadn't thought about the guard's responsibility or the safety of the people around him. The way his friend put it made everything seem so much clearer. The consequences of a careless action could ripple out in ways he hadn't imagined. "I got a fine," Mark continued, "and I'm banned from some areas of the city for a while. It's a bigger deal than I thought. They're serious about respect here." His friends nodded, processing the information. They didn't seem angry anymore, but Mark could tell they were disappointed. They had trusted him to be responsible, and he had let them down. He hadn't just embarrassed himself, he had embarrassed them, too. "We just want to make sure you're okay," one of his friends said, her tone softening. "But you've got to be more careful. You can't just mess around like that, especially when you're in a place that's important to people. You've got to think about the bigger picture." Mark looked down at the ground, his mind reeling. He had learned a hard lesson, and it was one that he would never forget. The fine and the ban from certain areas were just part of it. What stung more was the disappointment of his friends, the way his actions had affected those around him. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Mark tried to shake off the feeling of guilt, but it lingered in the back of his mind. He still had time left on his trip, but it was hard to enjoy anything knowing what had happened. He had made a mistake, and he knew it was one that would stay with him for a long time. As he walked through the city with his friends, Mark couldn't help but feel a shift in the way he saw things. What had seemed like a harmless joke had turned into a lesson about respect, responsibility, and the impact of his actions. The next morning, Mark woke up to the sound of his friends talking quietly in the next room. They were preparing for the day ahead, but Mark knew things weren't going to be the same. The events of the previous day had left a mark on him, and it was hard to shake off the feeling of guilt. He had always prided himself on being the life of the party, the one who could make everyone laugh. But now, he wasn't so sure about that. The joke he had pulled had gone too far, and it had cost him more than he had ever expected. When he met up with his friends, they tried to act normal, but there was an unspoken understanding that things were different. They weren't mad at him, but they had seen the consequences of his actions. They had watched as he faced the reality of what had happened, and it had made them realize the importance of thinking before acting. They had learned something, too. Sometimes, even a small mistake could change everything. As they walked through the city, Mark couldn't help but notice how much more aware he was of his surroundings. He had always enjoyed the hustle and bustle of the place, but now everything seemed more significant. The guards he had once seen as mere statues on horseback now felt like symbols of something important. He thought about how they stood there, day after day, upholding tradition and authority. They weren't there to be made fun of. They were there to protect and preserve what mattered to the people. Mark hadn't understood that before, but now he did. The restrictions that had been placed on him were still a reality, but Mark wasn't as upset about them as he had been the day before. He knew that they were a result of his actions, and he had to accept them. The fine was one thing, but the ban from certain areas of the city felt like a reminder of his mistake. He couldn't just erase what had happened, no matter how badly he wanted to. But in a way, that was a good thing. He needed that reminder to help him learn and grow. As the day went on, Mark found himself reflecting more and more on the lesson he had learned. It wasn't just about throwing rocks at a horse or upsetting a royal guard. It was about understanding the larger picture. It was about respecting the people and places that mattered to others. It was about realizing that sometimes actions have consequences that you can't undo. The world wasn't just a backdrop for his entertainment. It was a place full of people who had their own stories, their own traditions, and their own ways of life. He had taken that for granted, but now he was seeing it with new eyes. By the time the sun started to set, Mark was in a different frame of mind. He had accepted that his trip wasn't going to be perfect, but that didn't mean it had to be ruined. He could still make the most of the time he had left, but he knew that he needed to be more careful in the future. He wasn't the carefree prankster he had been before. He was someone who had learned a valuable lesson, and he wasn't going to forget it. When he looked at his friends, he saw that they weren't just walking beside him. They were understanding, too. They had been there with him through the whole ordeal, and they had seen how he had handled the consequences. They weren't judging him anymore. Instead, they were supportive, and they knew that he would be a little wiser moving forward. They had all learned something, and that was the real takeaway from the experience. As Mark sat down for a quiet dinner that evening, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt the day before. He had made a mistake, but that didn't define him. What mattered was how he chose to move forward. He had learned a lesson that would stay with him long after his trip ended. The world was a bigger place than he had realized, and he knew now that he had to approach it with more thoughtfulness and respect. It wasn't just about the fine or the ban. It was about being the kind of person who understood the importance of his actions. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he was capable of learning from his mistakes.